The Woman from Lem. You buy a charming little limestone figure, put it on your mantelpiece, and suddenly your whole family drops dead. It's the ultimate buyer's remorse. Also known as the goddess of death, the Woman from Lem is a small, crude limestone statue carved somewhere around 3500 BC. It was dug up in Cyprus in 1878, during a time when wealthy British elites loved collecting weird ancient antiquities for their parlors. The statue portrays a naked, slightly creepy-looking female figure, possibly an early fertility goddess. It's the exact kind of thing you'd see in the first act of a horror movie right before the lights start flickering. According to the legend, the statue was passed around between 4 different wealthy families, and it completely wiped out every single household that owned it. The first owner was Lord Elfont. Within 6 years of putting this rock in his house, 7 members of his family were dead, including himself. A massive tragedy. So the estate sold it. The next owner was a guy named Ivor Minucci. 4 years later, he and his entire family were dead. The third owner, Lord Thompson Noel, lasted another 4 years before his entire household suffered the exact same fate. By the time it got to the fourth owner, Sir Alan Biverbrook, the pattern was set. Biverbrook, his wife, and their 2 daughters died suddenly. His 2 surviving sons, reasonably terrified that they were next on the hit list, grabbed the statue with whatever the 1800s equivalent of a 10-foot pole was and donated it to the Royal Scottish Museum in Edinburgh. Problem solved, right? It's in a museum, it's safe. The museum curator who personally handled the piece, unpacking it and logging it into the archives, reportedly fell mysteriously ill and died within a year. A solid case of ancient, supernatural revenge. Today, the statue is kept behind thick glass in the museum, and the staff supposedly refuse to touch it under any circumstances, using heavy gloves if they absolutely have to move it. So, did a Chalcolithic fertility goddess systematically assassinate dozens of British aristocrats? Well, no. It turns out, ancient limestone is incredibly porous, and sealed, unventilated 19th century houses were basically incubators. The statue wasn't carrying a curse, it was carrying massive, concentrated colonies of toxic spores and ancient bacteria that had been gestating in the dirt for 5,000 years. Combine a lungful of tomb mold with 1800s medicine, where doctors were still prescribing cocaine for a cough, and bleeding people with leeches to cure a fever, and yeah, a high mortality rate isn't exactly a mystery. When a family gets sick from an unknown bacterial infection spread by a dirty rock, they die. And when they die, the surviving relatives don't blame the lack of penicillin. They blame the scary-looking statue on the mantelpiece. It's not magic. It's just terrible hygiene. Tutankhamun's tomb. It's 1922, and a British archaeologist named Howard Carter has spent years digging in the Egyptian desert, funded by a wealthy aristocrat named George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. Carter finally strikes gold. He finds a sealed doorway that hasn't seen sunlight in over 3,000 years. He peeks inside and famously declares he sees wonderful things. The media absolutely lost its mind. It was the archaeological discovery of the century. But then, things got dark. Just 6 weeks after the burial chamber was opened, Lord Carnarvon died in a Cairo hotel. The press immediately invented the Curse of the Pharaohs, claiming that an ancient inscription in the tomb promised death on swift wings to anyone who disturbed the resting place of the boy king. Suddenly, everyone connected to the expedition started dying in horrible ways. An American financier named George J. Gould visited the tomb and died of a fever a few months later. Arthur Mace, a member of the excavation team, died of pneumonia. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, the radiologist who x-rayed the mummy, mysteriously dropped dead. Carnarvon's half-brother died of malaria. Howard Carter's secretary was found smothered in his bed, and his father committed suicide shortly after. If you coughed, went bankrupt, or stubbed your toe within 50 miles of Egypt, the newspapers blamed King Tut. It was a media frenzy of supernatural terror. Here's the profoundly boring math. 58 people were present when that tomb and sarcophagus were opened. Only 8 died over the next dozen years. And most of the people who worked most closely with the mummy lived into their 70s and 80s. Howard Carter, the guy who actually cracked the seal and handled the corpse the most, lived to be 64 and died of lymphoma 17 years later. So what killed Lord Carnarvon? A mosquito bite. Seriously. He got a nasty mosquito bite on his cheek, accidentally sliced it open with a razor while shaving, and it got infected. He developed blood poisoning, which turned into pneumonia. It's also worth noting that Carnarvon had survived a brutal car crash 20 years earlier that had permanently wrecked his lungs, making him incredibly vulnerable to respiratory infections. But what about the others who got sick? Well, consider what happens when you seal organic matter, food offerings, and a human body inside a warm, dark, unventilated stone box for 3,000 years. Modern science has found that ancient tombs are packed with toxic fungi, specifically Aspergillus flavus. Breathing in those dust clouds is a recipe for severe lung infections, especially in an era before antibiotics existed. They weren't fighting off the ancient wrath of Anubis. They were breathing in 3 millennia of sealed fungal spores and minor natural radioactivity. Not exactly the wrath of the gods. Just awful, deadly workplace safety. The Basano vase. Supposedly a 15th century wedding gift forged in a village near Naples, Italy. The story goes that a beautiful young bride was handed this ornate silver vase the night before her wedding. She clutched it to her chest, went to sleep, and never woke up. She died clutching the silver safely to her heart, vowing revenge on whoever murdered her. From there, the vase became a literal hot potato of death. Every family member who inherited it supposedly caught a strange fever and vanished or died shortly after. Realizing the thing was a genuine hazard to human life, a local priest reportedly instructed the family to bury it in consecrated ground. It stayed hidden in the dirt for centuries. Fast forward to 1988. A guy is digging in his yard in Italy and unearths the vase. Inside, he finds a piece of parchment with a wildly dramatic warning. Beware, this vase brings death. Naturally, because humans are incredibly smart, he threw the warning note in the trash and immediately auctioned the vase off. A local pharmacist bought it. 3 months later, the pharmacist dropped dead of a mysterious illness. The family sold it to a 37-year-old surgeon. 2 months later, the surgeon died. The next owner, an archaeologist who really should have known better, died within 3 months from an unknown infection. The vase gained a notorious reputation, making it almost impossible to sell. Another owner tried his luck and reportedly died within a month. Eventually, one terrified family supposedly just threw the vase straight out of a second-story window, nearly hitting a policeman on the street below. The police confiscated the vase, but couldn't find a single museum willing to take it. According to the legend, the police ended up burying it again in a secret, undisclosed location just to get rid of it. Terrifying, right? A cursed silver bullet of a vase. Except, consider this. The 15th century wasn't exactly known for strict FDA regulations on homewares. Old ceramics, glazes, and even ornate silverwork often involved highly toxic elements like lead or mercury to achieve specific shines and finishes. Unadulterated silver is harmless, but if you're continuously storing acidic wine or acidic food in a damaged 15th century vessel that might have been lined with heavy metals, you aren't being cursed. You are just slowly, steadily poisoning yourself. And as for the string of incredibly fast deaths in the 1980s, That's where the story gets sketchy. There are 0 police records of a vase being thrown out a window. There are no names for the unfortunate pharmacist or the doomed surgeon. It seems highly likely that the vase existed, but the curse was completely fabricated by an antiquities dealer who wanted to drum up a spooky backstory to sell a piece of old silver. By the time it hit the internet, the story snowballed into a supernatural massacre. The Hope Diamond, 45 carats of flawless blue disaster. According to the myth, this massive stone was stolen from the eye of a statue of the Hindu goddess Sita in India. The angry goddess cursed everyone who ever touched the jewel, promising them nothing but bad luck, tragedy, and death. And man, did the diamond deliver. It was allegedly brought to Europe by a French merchant named Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, who reportedly caught a terrible fever and was torn apart by wild dogs in Russia. It eventually ended up in the hands of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, who, as you might remember from history class, both had their heads forcibly separated from their bodies during the French Revolution. But the curse hit its peak when the diamond was purchased by a wealthy American heiress named Evelyn Walsh McLean in 1911. She bought it from a Parisian jeweler for a massive sum, insisting she didn't believe in the curse. In fact, she famously told the seller, "Bad luck objects for me are lucky." She even admitted in her memoirs, "I like to pretend the thing brings good luck." She was wrong. Soon after she bought the rock, her mother-in-law and her father both died within a single year. Evelyn herself developed a severe, crippling morphine addiction. Her 9-year-old son Vincent, who was heavily guarded his entire life, was killed in a horrific car accident. Her daughter, Evie, committed suicide by overdosing on sleeping pills at the age of 19. Her husband, Ned, left her for another woman, went entirely bankrupt, was declared legally insane, and died in a psychiatric hospital. Evelyn eventually died of pneumonia at age 60, completely broken by tragedy. It's hard to look at that list of horrors and not blame the giant blue rock sitting on her neck. But let's be real. Look closely at the victims. Tavernier, the guy supposedly eaten by dogs? He actually lived to be 84 years old and died peacefully of natural causes. French royalty during the French Revolution didn't need a cursed rock to lose their heads. They spent decades violently starving the peasant class, and the peasants handled the rest. The McLean family tragedy was devastating, but it belongs to a much more grounded web of immense wealth, zero accountability, mental health struggles, and addiction. Crashing a car or developing a drug habit in the high society world of the early 20th century wasn't exactly rare. So where did the curse come from? It was almost entirely made up by a sleazy, absolutely brilliant French jeweler named Pierre Cartier. Cartier bought the diamond in 1909, but couldn't find anyone willing to drop millions of dollars on a single rock. Knowing Evelyn McLean loved a good story and was obsessed with unique status symbols, he deliberately fabricated the curse of the Hope Diamond. He made up the story about the wild dogs. He embellished the Marie Antoinette connection. He even orchestrated a bizarre sales tactic where he reset the stone, brought it to the US, and left it with Evelyn over the weekend, essentially daring her to keep it. It worked. Evelyn later wrote, "At some time during the night, I began to want the thing." Cartier knew that rich, bored elites would pay double if a diamond came with an edgy, spooky backstory. He even included a clause in the sales contract that if anyone in her family died within 6 months, he would exchange the diamond for other jewelry. It wasn't a curse. It was just an incredible, cutthroat marketing campaign that accidentally exploited a family's very real, very tragic sequence of depression. The Unlucky Mummy. Sitting in the British Museum right now is a painted wooden coffin lid. It's officially known as Artifact EA22542. It doesn't even have an actual mummy inside it. It's basically just the lid. But it wears the heavy, terrifying title of the deadliest artifact in London. The legend says anyone who bought it handled it, or even took a picture of it, found utter disaster. It was bought in Egypt in the late 1800s by a wealthy Englishman named Thomas Douglas Murray. According to the story, right after buying it, a gun exploded in his hand while he was duck hunting, forcing an amputation. His traveling companions supposedly died of obscure fevers. When the artifact finally made it to England, the misfortunes followed. It caused utter financial ruin for its owners. Ghostly figures supposedly haunted night watchmen at the museum. Photographers claimed their cameras inexplicably jammed and shattered when they tried to take pictures of the painted face, as if the wood itself rejected technology. The stories grew entirely out of control. It got so ridiculous that early 20th century journalists claimed the unlucky mummy was secretly smuggled out of England and put onto the RMS Titanic to be secretly shipped to New York. The mummy cursed the ship, caused it to hit the iceberg, and drowned 1,500 completely innocent people just for being on the same boat as it. The truth? The mummy lid never left London in 1912. It was sitting safely in the British Museum the night the Titanic sank. The entire Titanic story was a complete fabrication created by bored newspapers trying to sell copies. Specifically, the story was popularized by a journalist named William Stead, who, ironically, did die on the Titanic. Stead was known as the father of investigative journalism, but he was also a massive spiritualist, with a lifelong obsession with the supernatural and a weird premonition that he was going to die by drowning. Years earlier, he had actually co-written the original mummy ghost story with Thomas Murray, after looking at the coffin lid in the museum and deciding it looked evil. When Stead boarded the Titanic, he spent the voyage entertaining the first-class passengers by telling them his made-up ghost story about the cursed mummy. After the ship sank and Stead drowned, a survivor told the New York World newspaper about Stead's creepy campfire tale. The newspaper blurred the lines, and suddenly, the public believed the mummy was actually on the ship. As for the first owner, Thomas Murray, he didn't die bankrupt. He lived a very long, very wealthy life, introduced the Pekingese dog breed to England, and founded an Egyptology scholarship at Oxford. He just happened to accidentally shoot himself in the arm while hunting, which is a thing that happens when you run around marshes with early 20th century shotguns. When you convince the public an object is cursed, they will blame it for everything from a global maritime disaster to a sprained ankle. The unlucky mummy is just a piece of painted wood that became a magnet for confirmation bias and early 20th century clickbait. Utzi the Iceman. In 1991, two German hikers in the Alps stumbled across what they thought was a lost, frozen mountaineer melting out of a glacier. They called the police. It turned out to be a man who had been murdered 5,300 years ago. He was perfectly preserved in the ice, basically a time capsule from the Copper Age. And then the bodies started dropping. Over the next 15 years, 7 people closely connected to the discovery and study of the mummy died in a string of highly unusual accidents. It started with Helmut Simon, the hiker who actually found Utzi. In 2004, he was hiking the Alps, got caught in a blizzard, fell off a cliff, and froze to death, in the exact same mountain range where he found the mummy. Eerie. Then came Dieter Vornecke, the head of the mountain rescue team sent to find Helmut's body. Just an hour after Helmut's funeral, Vornecke dropped dead of a massive heart attack at age 45. Then there was Rainer Henn, the forensic pathologist who put Utzi in the body bag. He was driving to a convention to give a lecture about the mummy when he was killed in a horrific head-on car crash. Next was Konrad Spindler, a leading archaeologist who publicly scoffed at the curse, telling reporters, "It is all a media hype. The next thing you will be saying, I will be next." He died of complications from multiple sclerosis shortly after. Finally, Tom Loy, A molecular biologist who discovered the blood of 4 different people on Utzi's clothes died of a rare blood disease just before finishing a book about the mummy. 7 dead experts. The media screamed that Utzi, furious at being ripped out of the ice, was systematically seeking revenge on everyone who touched him. The reality? The Curse of the Iceman is a masterpiece of statistical manipulation. Hundreds of people worked on the Utzi project over decades. We're talking scientists, journalists, helicopter pilots, curators, and museum guards. Statistically, over a 15-year period, some of those hundreds of people were absolutely going to die, especially since half of them lived in the mountains and engaged in high-risk alpine sports for fun. If you ignore the hundreds of scientists who worked on the mummy and lived long, happy, totally uneventful lives, and only look at the handful who died from car crashes or heart disease, any group project looks like a supernatural massacre. The Black Orlov Diamond, sometimes called the Eye of Brahma. If you thought the Hope Diamond was bad, the Black Orlov is a heavy, dark 67-carat diamond with a history written almost entirely in suicides. Like the Hope Diamond, the tale says it was stolen from an idol in a shrine in India by an incredibly foolish monk. To punish the world, the stone drove its owners to absolute madness. The curse specifically targeted 3 people. First, a European diamond salesman named J.W. Paris imported the stone to the United States in 1932. Within weeks of selling the diamond, he allegedly walked up to the roof of a giant Manhattan skyscraper and jumped to his death. Then, the diamond supposedly found its way into the hands of 2 different Russian princesses, Princess Leonila Galitsine Baryatinsky and Princess Nadia Vigin Orlov. In 1947, within exactly 1 month of each other, both women reportedly jumped to their deaths from tall buildings in Rome, Italy. 3 owners, 3 identical, tragic suicides. The story was so terrifying that in the 1950s, a new diamond dealer bought it and immediately had the massive stone cut into 3 smaller pieces, desperately hoping to literally break the curse. It makes a terrifying narrative, but dig into the history and the ghost story falls apart instantly. The Russian nobles weren't pushed out of windows by an angry rock. They were refugees. They had lost their homeland, their royal status, and their immense wealth during the violent Soviet Revolution. They fled to Italy with nothing. Depression and trauma were entirely real, crushing forces in their lives. And the gem dealer in 1932? He was facing massive financial ruin during the height of the Great Depression. Businessmen jumping out of windows in the early 1930s sadly wasn't due to an ancient curse from India. It was due to the complete collapse of the global economy. Like the Basano vase, the Black Orlov is a magnet for the expectation effect. Tragic suicides happened, and people desperate for a sensational explanation blamed a lump of pressurized carbon instead of acknowledging vast human despair. King Casimir's tomb. In 1973, archaeologists in Krakow, Poland, decided to open the tomb of King Casimir IV. He was a powerful ruler from the 15th century, buried deep inside the Wawel Cathedral. When the project was announced, the local media joked about the curse of Tutankhamun, telling the scientists to be careful. It was not a joke for long. A team of 12 scientists entered the royal vault, opening the rotting wooden coffins with the permission of the Archbishop of Krakow. Within days of the exhumation, the main specialist of the conservation work and an architect on the team suddenly died, one from a massive stroke. Over the next few months, 10 of the original 12 researchers who entered the tomb were dead. Some reports claim up to 15 workers who helped with the restoration eventually passed away from sudden strokes, heart failure, and mysterious, overwhelming infections. The public leaned hard into the supernatural. This was Eastern Europe, and the idea of a medieval king carrying a curse, or possibly even being a vampire, was incredibly popular in the local folklore. But scientists quickly suited up in hazmat gear and found the real culprit. And it was significantly more terrifying than a vampire. It was a microscopic, highly carcinogenic fungus called Aspergillus flavus. The sealed, damned stone of the crypt had acted as a perfect, undisturbed incubator for over 400 years. Aspergillus flavus is a saprophytic fungus that feeds on dead organic matter. But the real danger isn't the fungus itself, it's what the fungus produces. It secretes highly toxic and carcinogenic compounds called aflatoxins. These aflatoxins are classified as Group 1 carcinogens. When you inhale them, the aflatoxin B1 goes straight into your lungs, where it binds to your DNA and causes rapid, catastrophic mutations. It impairs the cilia in your throat, completely shutting down your body's ability to clear the airways. It causes acute hepatitis, severe liver damage, and completely destroys the human immune system. The moment those researchers cracked the lid of the casket, they didn't just smell old dust. They basically set off a biological bomb. The dormant spores became airborne, and the researchers inhaled massive doses of weaponized, concentrated bathroom mold that chemically dismantled their DNA from the inside out. The Tomb of Timur. Timur, often called Tamerlane in the West, was one of history's most brutal conquerors. In the 14th century, he carved a massive empire across Asia, leaving literal pyramids of human skulls in his wake. When he died, he was buried in a magnificent mausoleum called the Gur-e-Amir in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, and his tomb was sealed with a massive slab of dark jade that allegedly carried a warning: "When I rise from the dead, the world shall tremble." Another inscription supposedly found inside the tomb was even more specific, stating, "Whosoever disturbs my tomb will unleash an invader more terrible than I." Fast forward to June 1941. Soviet anthropologist Mikhail Gerasimov leads a state-sanctioned expedition to officially open Timur's tomb. Gerasimov was famous for developing a brilliant, pioneering scientific method of facial reconstruction from skeletal remains. He had already reconstructed the actual face of Ivan the Terrible, and Joseph Stalin specifically commissioned him to pull Timur out of the ground to confirm his identity and reconstruct his face. Local residents and Muslim clerics surrounded the excavation site and literally begged the Soviets to stop, warning them about the ancient curse. The Soviets, being strictly atheist and trusting only Soviet science, ignored the locals. They commenced digging on June 16th and officially pried the heavy jade sarcophagus open on June 20th, 1941. When they opened the lid, the air was immediately filled with the overpowering smell of embalming resins, camphor, rose, and frankincense. Gerasimov quickly extracted Timur's skull for reconstruction. He actually confirmed historical texts that Timur was tall for his era, had a withered arm and a shorter leg, proving he was indeed Timur the Lame. A great day for science, except 2 days later. Exactly 48 hours after they disturbed the conqueror's bones, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union with the largest invasion force in the history of human warfare. Millions of soldiers crossed the border, initiating the bloodiest, deadliest conflict in human history. The curse had literally promised to unleash an invader more terrible than I, and 2 days later, Hitler arrived at the gates. The coincidence was so intensely terrifying that the story claims Soviet leadership panicked. As the Nazis pushed deeper into Russia, threatening to destroy the entire country, Stalin allegedly ordered Gerasimov to return the bones to the tomb with full Islamic burial rites to appease the ancient warlord. They reburied Timur on December 20th, 1942. A month later, the tide of the entire war shifted. The Soviet Union won the Battle of Stalingrad, crushing the Nazi army and arguably saving the world. It's the ultimate, undeniably terrifying curse story. Except, history is stubborn. Hitler hadn't been nervously waiting for some Soviet anthropologists to crack open a rock in Uzbekistan. He had been planning the invasion of the Soviet Union for months. The panzer tanks and 3 million German soldiers were already massed on the border, while Gerasimov was still arguing with the local clerics. You don't launch the largest military operation in human history on a 2-day notice because a scientist picked up a dusty skull. It was just a profoundly terrible, unimaginably horrific coincidence of timing. And finally, the Terracotta Army. In March 1974, a group of poor farmers in Shaanxi Province, China, were digging a well during a severe drought to save their dying crops. One of the farmers, Yang Jifa, struck something hard in the dirt with his hoe. It was the clay head of a soldier. He, his brothers, and their neighbor Wang Puzhi had accidentally discovered the Terracotta Army, an estimated 8,000 clay soldiers buried 2,000 years earlier to protect China's first emperor in the afterlife. It was the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. History was changed forever. But for the farmers who found it, the emperor's curse was very real, and it utterly destroyed their lives. At first, some locals were terrified of the statues, treating them as taboo and fearing they were demons or angry gods that would punish the village. As it turns out, the real threat was the state government. As soon as officials realized the magnitude of the find, they moved in. The farmers' land, their absolute only source of income, was immediately seized to build massive tourist centers, museums, and gift shops. Their homes were demolished, and their 2,000-year-old village was completely wiped off the map. And their reward for discovering a site that now makes hundreds of millions of dollars in tourist revenue every single year? The farmers were given 10 yuan per cart of pottery fragments they had brought to the local museum. It totaled 30 yuan. That money went straight to their production unit, and each individual farmer walked away with about 13 fen, the equivalent of half a day's work. Later, Yang Jifa reportedly received a one-time payout of 5,000 yuan for his stolen farmland. The discoverers were plunged into absolute, crushing poverty. They lost their land and had no way to feed themselves. As one of the original farmers, Yang Chuanyi later said, "Officials and businessmen have made a lot of money from the terracotta warriors, but not us. Families here are too poor to afford medicine." The tragedy escalated viciously. Wang Puzhi, suffering from heart disease and unable to afford any medical treatment, hung himself in 1997 to avoid being a financial burden to his family. Within 3 years of his suicide, 2 of the youngest farmers of the group died in their 50s, completely jobless, penniless, and dying in agonizing pain from treatable illnesses because they couldn't afford doctors. Yang Jifa had a slightly different ending, but it wasn't much better. In 1998, U.S. President Bill Clinton visited the museum and asked Yang for his autograph. Yang didn't know how to write. He reportedly drew 3 circles on a piece of paper. Embarrassed, the government taught him calligraphy and gave him a job sitting in the museum gift shop, signing books for tourists for an incredibly modest monthly salary, while watching his cultural heritage be sold for massive profits. Locals whispered about the emperor's curse. The idea that the ancient emperor, furious that his army was disturbed, systematically ruined the men who dug them up. But there was no ancient magic at work. It was just a tragedy of infrastructure and greed. They weren't cursed by a ghost. They were simply swept aside by massive state development and left entirely without a safety net, watching businessmen and officials get absurdly wealthy off the land that was stolen from them. It's a lot easier to blame a 2,000-year-old clay statue for your misery than it is to look at the cold, ruthless cruelty of modern economics. So, what have we learned from all this? If you believe an object is dangerous, your brain will desperately try to blame it for everything bad that ever happens. If you own a cursed mummy, suddenly a sprained ankle or a bad flu is proof of dark magic. It's just humans looking for patterns. The past isn't haunted, it's just highly toxic, very dirty, and full of terrible coincidences. Humans love telling a good ghost story because a ghost story makes sense. A ghost story gives death a reason. But the boring reality is that sometimes rocks are just full of mold. Sometimes people jump out of windows because they don't have enough money, and sometimes you just get a really bad mosquito bite. But maybe leave the ancient artifacts in the ground anyway, just to be safe.